Let's begin by discussing the first additive bilingual program, two-way dual language programs. So in the United States, the two-way dual language programs are composed of an equal mixture of language minority students, so for example, native Spanish speakers or native Mandarin speakers, and then the other half of the class is composed of native English speakers. There's an equal amount of instruction time that's spent in both languages, hence the 50-50 part of the name. So 50% of the class will be taught in students' minority language, so the native language of half the class, the minority language speakers, so for example, Spanish. And then the other half of the instruction, 50%, will be taught in the majority language. So in the United States, that would be English. The goal of having that 50-50 breakdown in terms of instructional time is based on the concept that they do not want any language to become dominant. Because if one language becomes dominant over the other in the language context, that will privilege one group over the other. Also, that will mean that students will be primarily speaking that dominant language and they won't fully become completely bilingual in both languages. One thing to note, and this will be important for your final paper, is that research, including Collier and Collier, which we'll talk about a little later in this chapter, show that this model is the most effective model for both bilingual programs and ESL programs. In the two-way dual language programs, ELLs, or English language learners, have a higher proficiency in English, and they also develop higher academic proficiency in their native language, and they have higher levels in both compared to students who are in other types of bilingual programs or all English programs. So if the net goal is for students to learn the most English, dual language programs are the most effective at that. Also, if your net goal is to have the most content knowledge and skills, dual language programs are the best at that compared to other bilingual and ESL programs. And finally, if your net goal is also to preserve students' native language and become bilingual, dual language programs provide that as well. Furthermore, students who are native majority language speakers, so the native English speakers, also gain a second language. And they don't see, according to research, any loss in their ability to learn English. So if you were a native English speaker participating in a dual language program, you would be just as well off in terms of your English language development as if you took classes in all English instruction. While also, if you were that native majority speaker, so you were a native English speaker, apart from having the same level of English that you would have received with all English instruction, the benefit of participating in a two-way dual language program is that you will learn the minority language, so in that case, Spanish. And so you could use that language as well when you get older and when you go to college and in your future career. So additive bilingual programs are heteroglostic in nature. So that means you have students from various language backgrounds and various language levels. So we discussed that half the class will be native Spanish speakers and the other half will be native English speakers. But you also have students of various language proficiency levels within those groups, because some students will have more academic language that they're exposed to at home compared to other students. And so students will enter with different language proficiency levels and, of course, different native languages. The goal is that students will learn from their peers. So if students do enter with higher, let's say, academic vocabulary than others, the students with the lower academic vocabulary will benefit from hearing that higher academic vocabulary when they have those peer discussions, or when you have classroom discussions, or that those partner discussions or conversations during collaborative learning activities such as turn-in talk discussions or group projects. Moreover, the students that have a high academic vocabulary will benefit from reteaching the information to students, to their peers who have a lower level. Furthermore, the two-way dual language programs also promote cross-cultural respect and biliteracy. So that means being able to read and write in both languages. And so just on the surface level, because those students are learning two languages and there's not one dominant language over the other, that encourages cross-cultural respect and a value for different ideas, different languages, different cultures. And so that's one benefit of this two-way dual language program. Apart from that, once again, with the biliteracy, they could read and write in both languages. And so that can be very effective as an academic proficiency for later in school, but also, of course, as an occupational proficiency when they go into the workforce. In addition, most of the time, two-way dual language programs teach language through content areas. So they're not just going to focus on actually teaching the language rules of both languages, but they will actually teach grade level content, so math lessons, science lessons, social studies lessons, and reading comprehension lessons. All of those content courses will be taught in both languages. And the reason being is because they want students to stay at or above grade level. And so they're not going to neglect to teach students the grade level content areas, but rather they're going to teach that content in both languages. So maybe half the time they'll teach one content area in English, and then the other half will be in Spanish. Or maybe they might also devote some courses, let's say math and science, to English, while language arts and social studies will be primarily Spanish. In order for the two-way dual language programs to be effective, they need to last for at least 4 to 5 years. And the reason being, just like we've learned in earlier lessons, it takes about at least 4 to 5 years for students to learn CALP, or the academic vocabulary and the academic language proficiency. And so if you do not have students who are having 4 to 5 years of that language, they're not going to really become adequately proficient in that language so that they can maintain that language throughout their lives. They're much more likely to maintain their bilingualism if they develop full proficiency. So even if, let's say, they don't take their second language for half the day during junior high or high school, at least they've had a strong, firm background where they have become fluent in both languages. Ideally, though, of course, the more years in dual language programs, the better. So there have been movements in the United States, and there are also, of course, international schools and movements in other countries, especially European countries and other countries that have several languages as part of their system of education. In those countries, they have dual language programs that go from kindergarten all the way up to college. And that would be the ideal, where students would have about half of their instruction in one language and the other half in a second language, so that students fully become proficient in both. Students learn not only from the explicit language instruction of their teacher, so the teacher will give them instruction on vocabulary, sentence structure, syntax, and writing conventions in both languages. However, students also benefit from, like we kind of mentioned before, the peers modeling of the language. Only one language is used at a time during the instruction, so there won't be a lot of back and forth on purpose. Sometimes students will naturally code mix or code switch, and that's normal. However, the teacher will make a point to speak only one language at a time. So the teacher won't be going back and forth to translate between each core content subject. Instead, they'll have either like a day that's devoted all toward English. They'll have either and the next day will be devoted to Spanish, or they might have a subject that's always devoted to English, like I said, math and science, and then they might have subjects that are always devoted to the minority language, like Spanish, like history and social studies and fine arts. Or sometimes they switch by weeks. So one week will be English, the other week will be Spanish. So it really depends. But the main point is that they compartmentalize language. So one language is primarily being spoken at a time. There's not a lot of switching back and forth, at least by the teacher. Now, the students might do that indirectly because that's natural. But the teacher makes a cognizant effort to avoid code switching and code mixing. Another common type of additive bilingual programs in the United States are called developmental bilingual programs. Some people also call them heritage language bilingual education because they both have many commonalities and similar goals. So with developmental bilingual programs, the class is composed primarily or almost completely of minority language speakers. So in the United States, it would be all English language learners in the classroom. So that's the main difference between dual language programs and developmental programs. In that developmental programs are having a homogeneous population of English language learners or students who come from the minority language background. Deaf education is this type of bilingual education as well. Because if you have deaf education, all of those students are native sign language speaking students. And so that whole class is composed of only native sign language speaking students or students from the deaf community. So in the United States, what the developmental bilingual programs look like are that the English language learners will develop proficiency in their native language, and then they'll still remain in those bilingual programs and receive instruction in that first language until they're fully literate in that language and also have grade level proficiency in the 4 language domains in that native language. And they'll remain in those bilingual programs until the end of 6th grade. And as we'll see in future slides, students will still receive instruction in English as well for part of the day, but the priority of additive bilingual programs in general, and of course developmental bilingual programs, is that students develop proficiency in their native language, which they then transfer those skills to their second language, English. So they end up becoming proficient in both their native language and English. Similar to two-way dual language programs, developmental bilingual programs often take 2 different forms. So there's 50-50 developmental bilingual programs, and this would be where students, the English language learners, would be having the same percentage of their instruction from starting in kindergarten all the way to whenever they leave the developmental bilingual program, at least 6th grade or later. They would have 50% of that instruction in their native language, let's say Spanish, and 50% of their instruction in the majority language, English. The other form is a 90-10 developmental program. And so a 90-10 developmental program starts with almost all the instruction in kindergarten or in the earliest grades, maybe pre-K as well, in the minority language. And then the percentage of instruction in the minority language gradually decreases until it's 50-50, until the amount of instruction in the minority language let's say Spanish, is the same as the amount of instruction in the majority language, English. And once again, developmental bilingual programs have to last until at least the 6th grade. So that's another key characteristic of developmental bilingual programs. They're strong bilingual programs partially because they last a significant amount of time so that students have time to develop academic language, CALP, as we've talked about in other chapters. The third type is immersion bilingual education. This type is not as much common in the United States, but it is in some situations. Often these kinds of immersion bilingual programs are private schools, and they're very popular in Europe, for example. In immersion bilingual programs, they are geared toward the language majority group. And the language majority group will only receive instruction in the target language for a significant amount of time. And so in Europe, for example, in Sweden, you have students that spoke Swedish at home, and then when they started school, they started to learn almost all of their classes in English, with maybe some Swedish first language support and also some Swedish literacy skills to learn how to read in their native language. And so that's a popular system in Sweden, for example. Still, the language majority or the majority language is not lost because all of the students are speaking the majority language at home, and in the community, that's the language that's being spoken. And then eventually in the school system, that's going to be the primary language that's being spoken in the school. It just begins with a lot of immersion in the target language, the foreign language, English. So this could also be a perception of foreign language instruction, because students from the majority language, the majority culture, are learning a second language by choice. The majority language, like I mentioned before, is still valued. The teacher understands the majority language, and the teacher will use the majority language to provide support for the students. It would kind of be like in the United States if students started elementary school speaking Spanish for about 90% of the instruction time, all students, both native English speakers and native Spanish speakers, and then gradually Spanish became less and less of the instruction time until in junior high and high school it's more of like a foreign language period or 2 periods of the day. So it would take maybe 20 to 30% of instruction. So you would initially immerse students in that target language, but eventually that target language takes the role of like a foreign language. And the majority language, in our case, the United States English, would still be predominant throughout the school, because even starting in first and second in grade, a lot of the instruction starts to shift toward English, and then the language that's being spoken in pop culture on TV and movies and the radio is English, and in the social arena it's English, and then at home often the students are speaking in the majority language English as well. Another example might be Spanish daycare schools that I've seen in the United States. Often they're for affluent communities, and those families will send their children to those daycare schools so that they'll learn a second language, Spanish. But the understanding is that those students will still maintain their first language, the majority language English, and that they'll eventually become dominant speakers in the majority language English, because most of the school time, once they start K through 12 school, will be devoted to English, with Spanish as only a foreign language. In addition, most students in these programs enter with about the same level of background knowledge. There's not a huge disparity in between how much one student knows over the other, because they all kind of start out more or less as beginners. Sometimes they might have a little bit of background knowledge on some common words like, greetings, but for the most part, they all kind of come in at a same base level. There are two types of immersion bilingual programs. There's the early immersion, where students will start in elementary school. Let's say in Sweden, for example, they'll start in elementary school with mostly English instruction, but they'll still learn literacy through their first language. So they'll still learn how to read in Swedish. Just most of the time they'll be speaking in English. And then the idea is that since they're immersed in the language, that they'll learn more English that way. There's also the late immersion method, in which students will start, let's say, primary school in their native language, and then in junior high and high school, they have most of the instruction in the foreign language. And the idea behind this is that the students have developed a strong proficiency in the majority language, their native language, for the first couple of years, and then they shift toward this foreign language, the second language they want to learn, in junior high and high school. So both feature initially a lot of instruction, or a majority of the instruction, in the target language, the second language initially, and then gradually the percentage of the target language decreases until the majority language is still the one that's emphasized in school more often. So eventually the majority language takes up at least 50 to 60% of the instructional time, with the target language, the minority language that they were trying to learn as a second language, taking up less instructional time. So once again, this demonstrates that the majority language still becomes the predominant language spoken in the schools, and students still have a preference for their native language, which would be their majority language. So in the Swedish context, eventually, even though they have a lot of English instruction in Sweden in the beginning of the school system, like during elementary, eventually when they go to high school, they're having most of their classes in Swedish and only a couple periods of the day devoted to English. Now we're going to shift to Chapter 12, the effectiveness of bilingual education. So this chapter is focusing on which bilingual programs are the most effective. Also, how do bilingual programs compare to English as a second language programs? In this chapter, you will see that countless educational research studies have supported bilingual education. And we're going to go over some of the pivotal ones in our discussion today. Let's begin with Willig's 1985 study. Willig conducted a meta-analysis, which is a statistical technique to combine several different studies or research experiments together and to overview them as a whole. Willig found that bilingual programs that encouraged instruction in students' native language, or the minority language, were more effective than subtractive bilingual programs or ESL programs that were primarily in English. So students in those strong bilingual programs where they had significant amounts of proficiency in their native language, such as developmental or two-way dual language programs, had higher scores in English reading, English math, and English language arts. They also had advantages because they scored well on native language tests as well on those different content areas. So interestingly, even though they had less time of the day devoted to English instruction, those developmental or two-way dual language programs had students that scored higher on English than other English language learners that had only been taught in English. And we're going to explain why in the future. Another study by Herrera in 1992 studied kindergarten students all the way up to 6th grade students in 5 different states. It compared English-only structured immersion, so that was like the sink or swim approach, the all English, very little supports approach. It also compared transitional bilingual programs, which would be like early exit, where students start to learn English and start to transfer most of their instruction toward English starting at like the second or third grade. And so they don't necessarily become fully proficient in their native language, but rather they quickly learn their native language to shift toward the majority language, which that's going to be their main focus. And then, of course, developmental bilingual programs, which were late exit. So they were staying in bilingual programs and learning their native language as well as English up until at least the fifth or sixth grade. Ramirez found that developmental bilingual programs, or late exit programs, where they learned their native language, were the most successful out of all of those groups. It's interesting that by third grade, there wasn't that much difference between the students. But by sixth grade, so the longer the students stayed in those developmental bilingual programs, those developmental bilingual students scored higher in math, English language arts, and English reading than the students and the other programs who had had almost most of their instruction in all English situations. Collier in 1995 identified 4 factors that would be essential for effective educational programs for emergent bilinguals. So emergent bilinguals are basically English language learners. The first principle would be that the program must be socially, culturally supportive environment. So they must encourage the native culture and the native language of students. Second, students' first language, their native language, would be developed to a high level, so a high level of proficiency. Moreover, third, there would be an uninterrupted cognitive development, and this would be best achieved through continued first language development. So basically, you wouldn't have half of the elementary school, let's say kinder, first, second, and third, where you're doing mostly Spanish instruction and then instantly switch to English instruction all at once. So this outruled the idea of transitional bilingual education, which quickly shifted radically from Spanish instruction to all English instruction within maybe like a few months. Moreover, the programs have to encourage cognitively complex activities. So if you're teaching a second language, so if you're teaching the majority language, English, you need to make sure you have cognitively complex, rigorous activities that include higher order thinking skills. So you have to challenge those students. You can't dumb down the curriculum and teach them low-level skills and below-level content, because that will further keep them behind their peers. Thomas and Collier in 1997 found that first language development is the strongest predictor of long-term success in school. So in terms of whether students were going to graduate and do well on English exams in high school, the most amount of time they spent learning their first language, the more likely they were to be successful. Also, Thomas and Collier found that students should be taught in their first language grade level content for as many years as possible. So in the minimum would be 5th to 6th grade that they're being taught curriculum in their native language. And the idea is that because they were being taught that content in their native language, they're much more likely to retain and understand that information. And so they would be more likely to be at or above grade level if they were initially taught content in their native language. Moreover, you should include cognitively complex content instruction in English as well. So it can't just be all native language instruction, all Spanish all the time, but part of the day should be devoted toward learning English as well. And then that English that they're learning is cognitively demanding at a high level, and they're learning academic language, not just conversational, greetings. In 1997, Krashen found that Latinos are overrepresented in the dropout population. So 30% of Latinos drop out, and that is compared to 8.6% of white students and 12.1% of African Americans. And so there's a disproportionate amount of Latino students that are dropping out of school. Yet, Krashen also found that among those Latino students, students that have participated in bilingual education programs were much less likely to drop out. And so there was a net important benefit of having students participate in bilingual programs because they were more likely to stay in school. Lindholm-Leary in 2001 compared 4 different programs: English-only programs, transitional bilingual education programs, where you quickly switch toward students' second language English. They were also studied 50% minority language and 50% majority language English, which is called two-way dual language bilingual programs. And interestingly enough, they also studied 90% minority language, 10% majority language dual language programs. So those would be probably, the last one would be more like the developmental programs we talked about, where you start with a high amount in the minority language and then you gradually decrease until they're about equal, where it's about 50% of the time is minority language, 50% is the majority language English. Lindholm-Leary found that students with 10 to 20% of the time of their instructional time in English performed just as well on English proficiency tests as students who had received 100% English instruction, so English only. Also, they performed just as well as students that had received 50% English and 50% minority language instruction. So basically that means that even with a little exposure to English during the day, students could still have a high amount of English proficiency. And that English proficiency would be the same as if they had gone all day in an only English classroom. So basically it justified the idea of bilingual education, that most of the day could be spent in developing students' native language, and then part of the day could be spent during developing students' abilities in English, and that student would not be further behind in English. In fact, he would be at the same level as a student who had only been learning English the whole day. They also found that by 6th grade, Latino students in dual language programs outperformed transitional bilingual education. So this once again supports the principle that the more native language instruction, the better. In math, all students in dual language programs scored 10 points more than students in English-only classrooms. So that was an also interesting point, that even among content area tests in English, students in dual language learned more content in their second language than students who had learned the content in English-only classrooms. In 2002, Thomas and Collier did an educational study in which they ranked bilingual and ESL programs based on students' achievement on standardized tests. All of the students that participated in that study entered with little to no English proficiency, so they were all English language learners. And Thomas and Collier monitored the students' progress up until the highest grade that those students completed. If we look at the graphs, Thomas and Collier did 2 separate studies. In one school, they measured the performance of English language learners on a 5th grade national achievement test, and this test was in English. And if you look on the left side, students could have participated in 4 different types of programs at that school. They could have been in two-way bilingual education programs, developmental bilingual education programs, transitional bilingual educational programs, and English immersion or mainstream programs, so all English ESL. As you can see, the best programs out of all of them were two-way bilingual education programs. If you go to the right side, Thomas and Collier did a second study at a different school and in a different district. And in this study, they looked at the performance of English language learners on 11th and 12th grade achievement tests. In this situation, there were only 3 options. There was the transitional bilingual education option, where students would learn their native language for a couple years but quickly transition into all English instruction. Then there was the ESL content classes, where they learned content skills like math, science, social studies, all in English but with some English language learner supports, so some scaffolds. And then you had just English submersion, which is the sink or swim, where basically the English language learners were placed in regular classes with no support. As you can see, in this situation, when you compare these 3 groups, transitional bilingual education was the best one out of those 3 subtractive programs on the right side. If you looked at just those 2 ESL programs, though, the ESL content classes were the best one out of those ESL programs. ESL content classes, where they received some English language supports, was better than English submersion or sink or swim. So in a school district that only had ESL programs, let's say they didn't have any bilingual teachers for some reason, if you had an English language learner, you would recommend the ESL content classes compared to just sink or swim all English submersion classes with no supports, no scaffolds like visuals, language objectives, collaborative teaching, hands-on learning, kinesthetic learning. All those things are ESL scaffolds. But English submersion or English mainstream, which is sink or swim, does not provide those scaffolds. ESL content classes, however, do. And for that reason, they are the best ESL program. But, as we've talked about before, bilingual programs are better than ESL programs for English language learners. And the best bilingual program is two-way bilingual education, according to the research, as you can see on the left side. Another study was in the Houston ISD. It kind of reiterates what we just talked about. But if you look, the red line was just the native English speakers. So these were the non-minority language speakers. These were just the students that their only language was English, and that's what they grew up speaking at home. That was the red. And then they had in the blue people who were in the ESL content classes, where they learned all English, but they had some ELL scaffolds, and they learned the content skills, content subjects, math, science, social studies. Then in the yellow, the yellow were people who had no services, so that was basically submersion, because they refused any kind of ESL support or bilingual support. And then the green in this one was the former transitional bilingual education students. And as you see, on this achievement test in English, the transitional bilingual programs compared to former ESL content programs and no supports whatsoever were much better than those programs. This next one kind of just repeats the same thing, that any kind of bilingual program, even if it's only transitional bilingual programs with only a few years of native language support or native language instruction, will still be better than all English types of instructional practice, such as ESL content or submersion, ESL, submersion, immersion. This was just another graph of what happened in Maine. Thomas and Collier did another study in Maine, and as you can see, students in bilingual programs, bilingual immersion programs, which are like dual language or developmental bilingual programs, or most of the where a lot of the instruction is in students' native language, and eventually it becomes 50%, 50%. So 50% of the instruction in their native language, 50% of their instruction in the second language, English. As you can see, those students in those developmental bilingual programs where they had strong native language instruction performed better than students that only took classes in the all English context. And this is on a math test in English. So even learning content such as math in the native language was beneficial, even when they took the test in English. Having that native language support and that native language maybe pre-teaching of the concepts and that overall increased English ability by having more native language ability led to increased growth. Here's another graph. Once again, you can see the 4 different types. You have two-way bilingual education, late exit transitional bilingual education. So that would be when students leave the bilingual program after 6th grade. So they've been receiving instruction in their native language up until about the 6th grade. And then you have early exit on the lower left corner, which would be students that after about 2nd or 3rd grade, they transition all to English. And then finally you have the ESL pullout, and that would be where you would have students who receive ESL services. They would only receive instruction in English the whole day, but then for part of the day they would get pull-out support from an ESL trained teacher, and it would of course be only in English. So if you look at the different proficiencies and performance on the tests, the program that did the best was two-way bilingual education programs. And following closely behind were those developmental bilingual programs that were also called late exit, where students had 6 years of instruction in their native language. So as you can see, the more native language students had, the better they performed on an English language achievement test. To reiterate Thomas and Collier's conclusions, bilingual education that features home language instruction or native language instruction leads to better results in English than programs that are only taught in English. Developmental and two-way bilingual education programs are better than transitional bilingual programs. So this kind of goes back to what we talked about. The more years of instruction in the first language, the better academic outcomes. Two-way 50% Spanish and two-way 50% English did better for overall academics and also overall English development compared to programs that were only primarily 90% of the native language and only 10% English. So having a healthy balance of the native language of the students, Spanish, and their second language, English, was the most beneficial. Also, they found that the native English-speaking students who came from the majority culture and the majority language background learned Spanish and actually performed better in English than students who had only been in all English classes. So not only did they perform better in English than those students who were native English speakers and had only received instruction in an English classroom, but those students learned Spanish too. So they became bilingual. Oler and Eilers in 2002 did another study. In this study, they compared two-way dual language programs to English immersion programs in Miami. And so those English immersion programs, we would also call them English submersion. It's sink or swim. So there'd be very few English language learner supports or scaffolds. It would just be kind of throw the students into the general classroom and hope they learn. They found that there was not a difference in English language performance between students in the dual language program and in the English immersion program. So at face value, that seems like maybe we can't really discredit English immersion programs. But however, if you think about it, the students in the dual language program were only receiving 50% of their time of instruction in English. But even though they only received 50% of the time or half of the instructional time in English, they were performing at the same rate as English language learners who had taken class all the time, all day, 100% of the instructional time in English. So this proves to you that bilingual education can yield strong educational outcomes in both languages, students' native language and their second language, English. Another thing they found was that students who did participate in the dual language programs, apart from being at the same level as students who were in all English programs their whole lives, who only received 100% ESL English instruction, besides those two groups having the same amount of English ability, so they're both at the same level, the students who are in the dual language program learned a second language, or they remained bilingual. They had two languages that they were proficient in. A third finding they found was that the Latino students who participated in either program primarily spoke English. So there wasn't an issue of people not learning English just because they had studied in the bilingual program. Instead, they had the same English ability levels in the bilingual program, and also they were still having a preference to the majority language English. Genesee in 2006 found that students in late exit bilingual programs, so that would be like two-way dual language programs or developmental bilingual education programs, did better than early exit transitional bilingual programs. So once again, the more years in the native language, the better students would perform on achievement tests in English and also achievement tests in their native language. They found that bilingual proficiency and biliteracy led to a positive impact or a positive relationship to students' academic achievement. And that was once again on native language tests and tests in English. Also, by the end of the elementary school, the students in any type of the bilingual program had higher English reading and writing skills than English language learners who had only received 100% English instruction their whole lives. Now let's look back at those states that had chosen to make instruction only in English, and they had banned bilingual education. Let's see how students in those states performed. So just to give, once again, historical background from earlier chapters in Baker, in the late 1990s to early 2000s, 3 states had voters who approved of initiatives that banned bilingual education. The 3 states were California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. They said no more bilingual education in schools, and that schools could only teach all English instruction, no native language support. Let's see how those students did. In California, the actual legislature conducted an official study of all the different English programs in the state. They found that there was no evidence that because they had made their programs all English, that students had improved. So basically, there was no difference in English performance when students had bilingual programs versus when students had all English programs. The only main difference was students lost their native language with the all English programs. Interestingly enough, in 2004-2005, only 9% of students who were eligible to take the yearly progress measure were able to reclassify as fluent in English. And that was the same rate as before that all English referendum had been passed. So basically, there was no change. But once again, the net effect was that students were banned to speak their native language, and so they were more likely to lose their native language. Yet, there were no educational benefits, especially no benefits in English proficiency, from having all English programs. In Arizona, during those English-only programs, 60% of English learners made no gain in English. So obviously students were not progressing in those all-English classrooms. Moreover, 7% of students in those all-English classrooms were actually decreasing in their English ability from the year before. So it had a net negative effect on those students learning English. In Massachusetts, more than half of the English language learners that were tested who had participated in those all-English ESL Sink or Swim submersion programs had still limited proficiencies in English after 3 years in those all-English classrooms. So if those all-English classrooms were the panacea, the cure-all for these students' academic ills, it certainly was not. Because as you can see, after 3 years of that all-English sink or swim experience, those students were still limited in their English abilities. I want to, besides provide lots of empirical evidence, like research evidence, which I've just given you to justify why bilingual education is more beneficial than all English instruction, I also want to give some theory behind it, some logic. So first of all, bilingual education develops students' native language abilities. And as we've talked about in this class, additive programs such as two-way dual language programs and developmental bilingual programs encourage students to develop literacy abilities and academic language proficiency in their native language. As we've talked about, humans have a common underlying proficiency when it comes to language. So it's the same part of the brain that's used to learn and speak either language. And so based on that logic and what we've seen through research and through brain experiments and brain research, students will transfer their language skills from their native language to their second language. And they can transfer things like literacy skills, phonics patterns, so the sounds of different letters. Also the concepts of print, that print has meaning, that there's different organizations of print, and there's different purposes for print. Also syntax, how sentences are structured. And then cognates, so words that sound the same and mean the same across languages can easily transfer. A second reason that bilingual education programs are more beneficial than all English ESL programs is that in bilingual programs, students learn literacy in their native language, and they learn that with the support of their parents. If you think about it, if you are receiving bilingual instruction and receiving materials in your native language, and your teacher is spending a significant amount of time speaking in the native language, your parents can reinforce that at home by helping you with homework, reading to you in that native language. And that's very important, especially in the early grades, pre-K, kinder, first, second, third. Those are the most crucial years of school. And so during those school years, the most crucial years, you want to have lots of parental engagement. You also know that students are more likely when they're learning language, when they're learning to read, if they have more vocabulary and they understand the meaning of words, they're much more likely to develop reading fluency. Because when they're sounding out a word and using phonics and sounding out the sounds of a word, once they lock on and connect the sound of the word to a word they know the vocabulary of, they will read it and understand that word. So once again, increased vocabulary allows for better reading fluency, which leads to more reading comprehension. And once again, students have more comprehension of the content and the fundamentals of literacy, the foundation of math, the foundation of science, foundation of social studies. All of that they'll have more foundational knowledge because the content is taught to them in their language that they have more vocabulary and more proficiency in when they start school, their native language. So students do not fall behind because they've missed content, and they don't fall behind in terms of grade level content. A third reason why bilingual programs are more beneficial than ESL programs is that there's increased ELL parental involvement. So if parents can communicate with the teachers and they can read the homework, they can read the communication that's being sent to them, they're more likely to be able to help students with their homework because once again, those parents are most likely stronger in the native language of the students, which would be the language they're speaking at home. In addition, parents are much more likely to communicate with teachers and with school administrators. And so that's very important because they can catch if there's any gaps in knowledge or any issues in terms of behavior or learning progress, they can quickly support the teacher and learn of how they can best support their students at home. A fourth reason why bilingual programs are logically better than ESL programs that are only in English is that students have increased self-esteem when they're learning their native language. So when the instruction is in students' native language for part of the day, students recognize that their home culture is supported and they're affirmed. So bilingual programs encourage students to remain positive about their prior learning experiences and their prior experiences at home. Students are also more likely to find commonalities with the teacher because if the teacher at least knows the student's native language, they're probably more likely to understand that student's home culture. And so there's less of a disconnect between the students and the teacher. Moreover, as we talked about with Krashen's research, students are much more likely to be successful when they're being taught in their native language. And if they're much more likely to be successful, they're going to associate school with positive emotions and they'll have higher academic confidence. So when they do later start learning more and more English and things do start to get a little bit more difficult, or when they're faced with higher cognitive demand, they are going to have the stamina and they are going to have the grit and confidence to say, I can do this. Similar to what we've talked about in earlier chapters, bilingualism has led to several cognitive benefits. For example, students who are bilingual have been shown to have increased creativity and increased ability to have divergent thinking, so they can see different points of view and different perspectives. Also, they have been shown to have more associations between words, which means that they are able to describe things with more rich vocabulary and in more complex ways. Third, they also have increased cultural competence. So they know how to adjust their communication based on the speaker, based on the receiver of their language. So whoever they're speaking with, they know which language will be most effective to communicating with that person. And that's beneficial because they are able to read people's facial expressions and nonverbal communication skills. And so that's another part of cultural competence. Furthermore, they're more likely to see nuances in language and in also ideas in general because they can see they've seen different perspectives through having been exposed to different languages and different cultures. Moreover, they have increased metalinguistic awareness. So they have a better understanding of the functions of language, the syntax, how sentences are constructed, and also they have a better understanding of when to pay selective attention to particular parts of a sentence. And they're actually even better at distinguishing between words or parts of the sentence than monolingual students. I'd like to quickly go over our final paper. So please remember that the first half of the paper will be where you describe the different bilingual and ESL programs. And you have to describe at least 6. The more you describe, the better, and the more credit you will get. Remember, that part has to be at least 750 words. And so all of the information for the final paper will be in the 3rd section of our class. So basically, after the language acquisition paper, all of the things we learned were primarily geared toward our final paper. The second half of the final paper is the case study section. So I gave you 2 examples or 2 cases of English language learners, and you as an educator and an enlightened educator who's taken this class are going to provide recommendations to those parents. One thing to note is that in this district, there are all different types of bilingual programs and ESL programs. They have two-way dual language programs, they have developmental bilingual programs, they have transitional bilingual programs, they have ESL immersion or submersion, which is, the sink or swim. They have ESL content programs. They have ESL, sheltered ESL programs. However, among their bilingual programs, the only types of bilingual programs they have in that district are programs offered to native Spanish speakers or to people who are wanting to learn Spanish. So they do not have bilingual services for or bilingual teachers who speak other minority languages like Arabic, Chinese, Tagalog, Hindi, Vietnamese, Russian. The only types of bilingual programs or bilingual teachers they have are teachers who can speak Spanish and English. I'd like to quickly provide an overview and a conclusion to the principles of our class. So if you remember, in the first section of our class, we began to discuss the definitions and the measures of bilingualism. We also went over language targets and language contexts, and we had a conversation about trends in bilingualism internationally. Furthermore, we learned about the different ways how bilingualism can serve various practical purposes. So bilingualism as a resource across the globe. The second section of our class was focused upon how people learn language and how the brain conceptualizes language. So we learned about how people learn their first language as babies and toddlers. We learned about the stages in which ELL students learn their second language, English. We also discussed the cognitive benefits of bilingualism based on brain research, so the many positives of being bilingual. And we learned more about the process of the different types of language that people learn. So we learned about BICS versus CALP. So BICS is conversational language and CALP is academic language. And remember that BICS, the conversational informal language, the everyday communication, takes an English language learner about 1 to 2 years, while the academic language, CALP, can take from 5 to 10 years. And they've done studies, and the more language proficiency that a student has in their native language, the faster they're going to learn CALP, or academic language in English. Our third section of the class was similar to what we talked about earlier today. So I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you so much for all of your attention, for all of your hard work. I hope that you can see the relevance of what we've talked about in our class and that you felt this class is meaningful. And I wish you the best. I hope I can help you in any way. You can always reach me via email. And I'd like to end the note by saying please continue to make the world a better place. I know you've already done amazing things as people and as educators, and I know that you will continue to make a lasting impact on not only your students and your families, but also your community around you. So thank you very much.